The notification flashed on my screen at exactly 11:51 at night in my Boston office. A $75,000 pending charge at a luxury hotel in Lake Como, Italy. It was my corporate black card. The one my former mother-in-law Jessica had apparently stolen. I didn't panic. I didn't feel betrayed. I just opened my secure banking portal and initiated an immediate freeze. Have you ever dealt with a narcissist who treated your success like it was their personal piggy bank? Let me know your story in the comments below. I stared at the glowing monitor, the digital footprint of Jessica's theft cementing the absolute end of an era. For 5 long years, I had functioned as the silent investor in Jacob and Jessica's aristocratic facade. I wasn't treated as a wife, and I certainly was never embraced as a daughter-in-law. I was a useful appliance, a high-yield asset acquired specifically to fund their refined, archaic lifestyle. That was the trap of cruel normalization. When you are constantly surrounded by people who view extreme entitlement as a basic birthright, you slowly begin to audit your own boundaries. You accept the subtle dismissals, the backhanded compliments about my aggressive career path, and the quiet, insidious expectation that my hedge fund bonuses were simply family revenue. They conditioned me to believe that funding their elevated status was the rent I was obligated to pay for a seat at their sparse table. But that table was always rotting from the inside out. The depreciation of our marriage didn't culminate in a dramatic screaming match or a tearful confrontation. It ended exactly 3 weeks ago, quietly and clinically, when I reviewed our shared calendar and correlated Jacob's frequent golf retreats with the exact schedule of a 24-year-old tennis instructor at their elite country club. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why he did it. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was entirely clinical. It was a balance sheet, reconciling years of deficits. I simply opened my laptop, reviewed the ironclad infidelity clause in our prenuptial agreement, and called my surgical attorney, Matthew. Love, I now realized, had been nothing more than a subscription service, and I was entirely finished footing the exorbitant bill. I had initiated the divorce proceedings with surgical precision, locking Jacob out of all joint accounts before he even realized the locks had been changed. They weren't shocked by his betrayal. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along, that the financial appliance had unplugged itself. Discovering my stolen corporate card tonight was just the final, desperate overdraft of a morally bankrupt family. Jessica had always believed my wealth was a direct extension of her own social currency, a limitless resource she was entitled to tap whenever her own coffers ran inexplicably dry. She assumed I would absorb the $75,000 charge to avoid a public scandal. She calculated that my desire for peace would outweigh my demand for justice. It was a terrible, fatal miscalculation. I picked up my phone and dialed the international concierge line for my corporate banking tier. There was absolutely no hesitation. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. The divorce papers were filed and near finalization, the primary assets were securely shielded, and now Jessica had willingly handed me the exact legal lever I needed to dismantle her completely. This wasn't a breakdown, it was an accounting correction. I had spent years subsidizing their cruelty, writing off their gaslighting as the cost of doing business with old money, but the market had shifted. The tolerance for their toxic portfolio was at zero, and I prepared myself to execute the final trade. The immediate aftermath of the divorce had been a masterclass in financial self-defense and strategic boundary setting. While Jacob and Jessica spun a desperate narrative of my supposed coldness to their country club friends, I meticulously dissected the structural integrity of the life we had shared. Over 5 years, I had built my hedge fund from a struggling mid-tier firm into a recognized powerhouse managing billions in assets. I secured the massive promotions, navigated the crisis portfolios, and routinely put in the 90-hour weeks that broke lesser executives. Jacob, meanwhile, had treated my career like a piece of prime real estate he had cleverly acquired and developed. His family loved to introduce me at their endless charity galas as Jacob's brilliant wife, subtly framing my hard-earned success as a testament to his excellent taste in women. They eagerly consumed the lavish benefits of my labor, while actively resenting the raw ambition that produced it. I was expected to fund the yacht rentals, the bespoke wardrobing, and the extravagant charity donations, but to remain quietly in the background when the social credit was being distributed. It was a fundamentally parasitic business model, and the host had finally recognized the terminal infection. Jacob had fully expected a traditional, drawn-out negotiation. He anticipated a messy, emotional mediation where he could leverage my supposed guilt over prioritizing my career. He wanted permanent alimony. He wanted a massive maintenance stipend to preserve the elevated standard of living he had grown so accustomed to enjoying on my dime. He essentially demanded a golden parachute severance package for his own blatant infidelity. Matthew, my attorney, had crushed that expectation within the first 10 minutes of our deposition. We executed the infidelity clause with zero margin for error, stripping Jacob of any claim to my primary accounts, my firm equity, and my property investments. The Vance family had been stripped of their primary revenue stream overnight, leaving them entirely exposed and scrambling to maintain their performative elitism. But Jessica could not accept the new, harsh reality of her downgraded status. She operated under the stubborn delusion that her aristocratic bloodline granted her permanent immunity from the consequences of theft. Stealing my corporate black card was her way of aggressively asserting dominance, a desperate power play to prove she still had unfettered access to the vault. She had likely planned this extravagant Lake Como trip for months, promising her wealthy friends an all-expenses-paid Italian getaway, banking entirely on my silent, compliant submission. She viewed me as a vendor who had abruptly canceled a crucial service contract, and she was simply forcing the unauthorized transaction through. She didn't understand that the contract was dead, the accounts were sealed, and the vendor was now acting as a relentless debt collector. I watched the digital clock on my desk tick over to exactly midnight. The freeze on the card had been successfully processed by the server. The transaction was suspended in the void. Now, it was time to issue the formal, verbal notice of default across the Atlantic. I dialed the direct, unlisted number to the Lake Como resort. The concierge answered on the first ring, his voice a polished, deferential murmur of Italian hospitality. I calmly asked to be connected to Jessica Vance's suite. It was mid-morning in Italy, the absolutely perfect time for espresso on a sun-drenched terrace overlooking the water. When Jessica answered the line, she didn't sound the least bit surprised. She sounded expectant, ready to deliver a heavily rehearsed monologue designed to put me in my place. "Ashley," she drawled, her voice dripping with performative elitism and fake sympathy, "I suppose you received the alert. Try not to make a fuss. Consider it a parting gift to the family you so selfishly abandoned." I felt my pulse steady, operating at a slow and rhythmic pace. There was no panic, only the cold mechanics of retribution. "Jessica, we are divorced. You are currently attempting to process a $75,000 fraudulent charge on a stolen corporate card." She scoffed, a delicate dismissing sound meant to make me feel small. "Oh, please, it's a rounding error for your firm. I promised my dearest friends this retreat, and after the terrible humiliation you put my son through, it's the absolute least you owe us. Don't be so terribly middle class about money, Ashley. It's unseemly." Her arrogance wasn't infuriating. It was entirely predictable. She was playing a high-stakes game of social chicken, assuming I would flinch first to avoid any potential embarrassment. "I am not being middle class, Jessica. I am being analytical. You are currently in possession of stolen commercial property. I am in possession of a card that was legally issued to my daughter-in-law," she countered smoothly, clearly proud of her logic. "Former daughter-in-law," I corrected, my tone dropping to an absolute uncompromising freeze. "And the issuer is a major corporate entity that does not take kindly to international fraud." "You wouldn't dare," she snapped, the polished veneer cracking slightly under the pressure. "I am entertaining the wives of 3 massive board members here. If you decline this card, you will look like a petty, vindictive ex-wife." "They won't be looking at me, Jessica. They will be looking at the woman who cannot afford to pay her own hotel bill." I didn't wait for her next desperate response. I switched lines on my console and connected directly to Andrew, my corporate banking concierge. "Andrew, the Lake Como transaction is confirmed fraudulent. Lock the account permanently and initiate our standard corporate fraud protocols. Notify the merchant immediately that the physical card is stolen and the user is completely unauthorized." "Understood, Miss Vance. Executing the protocol immediately." I merged the calls back together just in time to hear Jessica's sharp, Panicked intake of breath. Ashley, tell this hotel right now that the card is valid. The manager is standing right at my table. The account is locked, Jessica, I said, my voice empty of any lingering sympathy. This wasn't revenge, it was accounting. Have a wonderful vacation. I disconnected the call with a single keystroke. The silence in my office was absolute and incredibly satisfying. The transaction was canceled. The liability was transferred back to the thief. The host had finally cut the parasite off at the source. I fully expected the matter to end with a declined card and a humiliating scramble for alternative funds. But exactly 10 minutes later, my phone rang again. It was an international number. An inspector from the local Italian Polizia di Stato was on the line. Through a rapid translator, he informed me that the luxury hotel management had flagged the incident not just as a standard declined payment, but as attempted grand larceny. When they politely asked Jessica for an alternative form of payment for the massive bill she had already racked up over the past 48 hours, she couldn't produce one. Then, the inspector relayed a specific detail that made the ambient air in my office turn to ice. He read the official name of the hotel and the specific terrace suite Jessica had booked for her group. It wasn't just any random luxury resort. It was the exact venue where Jacob and I had held our rehearsal dinner 5 years ago. She had stolen my corporate black card to fund a lavish, highly visible vacation for her friends at the very location that marked my official entry into their toxic family. It was a calculated, deliberate desecration of my personal history. It was a bold statement that she believed she owned my past, my memories, and my hard-earned money. The criminal twist wasn't just the blatant financial theft, it was the breathtaking psychological audacity. Senora Vance, the inspector asked over the crackling line, do you wish to pursue formal criminal charges for the unauthorized use of the corporate asset? I stared out at the sprawling city lights of Boston spreading out below my corner window. I thought about the sheer, staggering entitlement required to sit on that specific historic terrace, drinking vintage champagne bought with stolen corporate funds, toasting to my absence. Yes, Inspector. The individual is absolutely not authorized. The card was obtained through physical theft. I will forward all necessary corporate documentation to your department immediately. The inspector confirmed that Jessica and her high society guests were currently being detained in the hotel lobby until the local authorities arrived to officially process the fraud and theft of services complaint. She hadn't just picked a random vacation spot, she had picked a literal crime scene with a breathtaking view. I opened my email client and forwarded the bank's official fraud alert, the filed divorce petition, the emergency asset freeze order, and the card's strict issuance documents directly to the Italian authorities and the hotel's aggressive legal department. I ensured there were 0 remaining loopholes, no gray areas, no family misunderstandings to hide behind. It was a straightforward, easily provable case of international corporate fraud. Jessica had built her entire carefully constructed identity on the public perception of untouchable grace and inherent superiority. Now, she was about to be escorted out of a 5-star resort by the local police, surrounded by the very high society friends she had brought along specifically to impress. The luxurious environment she had weaponized against me had rapidly become her holding cell. I closed my laptop with a satisfying snap. The audit was officially complete. The execution of judgment was swift, methodical, and merciless. By the following morning, the legal and social fallout had buried the Vance family entirely. Jacob, desperate to salvage his mother's catastrophic situation, attempted an emergency legal maneuver to halt the final decree and demand retroactive alimony, claiming sudden financial duress. Matthew, my attorney, dismantled the frivolous filing before lunch, citing Jacob's heavily documented infidelity and explicitly reminding his counsel that filing baseless motions would result in immediate countersuits for exorbitant legal fees. Jacob's pathetic attempt to extract emergency cash from me was crushed under the heavy weight of his own breached contract. Meanwhile, in Italy, Jessica's carefully curated social network completely disintegrated. When the local police arrived at the resort, her wealthy friends, the very people she had tried to deeply impress with my stolen money, deserted her instantly to avoid any association with a criminal fraud investigation. They booked their own expedited flights home, leaving Jessica to face the strict local magistrate entirely alone. She was detained, her passport temporarily confiscated, while the hotel's legal team drafted their aggressive demands for immediate restitution. But the true climax of this entire ordeal wasn't the dramatic arrest, it was the illusion of power in an empty safe. For decades, Jessica and Jacob had operated as if their aristocratic name was a tangible currency, a vault full of gold that commanded instant respect. But when the vault was finally opened under the harsh, unforgiving light of legal scrutiny, it was completely empty. They had absolutely no liquid assets, no leverage, and no real influence. Their power had always been a fragile hologram projected entirely by my money. When I turned off the projector, they ceased to exist in the elite circles they valued most. To avoid lengthy Italian jail time, Jessica was forced to rapidly liquidate the only asset she had left, her sprawling, heavily mortgaged ancestral estate in Connecticut. Fearing a highly publicized lawsuit, mounting international legal fines, and a forced, messy foreclosure, she was forced to accept a predatory, rapid cash buyout for the property to satisfy her debts. When she returned to the United States a week later, stripped of her pride and completely financially ruined, she quietly moved into a small, rented condominium on the industrial outskirts of the city, miles away from the exclusive country clubs and charity galas she used to rule. Jacob, permanently stripped of his lifestyle subsidy and saddled with his mother's ongoing legal crisis, was forced to take a mid-level corporate job he considered deeply beneath him. They weren't just defeated, they were structurally dismantled. The power flip was absolute. I hadn't raised my voice, I hadn't engaged in a pointless screaming match, and I hadn't shed a single tear of despair. I had simply applied the exact rules of the financial world they so deeply despised, but desperately relied upon. I audited their actions, found them in severe default, and executed the penalty clauses without mercy. The ledger was finally balanced, and the accounts were closed for good. 1 year later, the heavy machinery of consequence had settled into a quiet, permanent hum. I sat in a sleek, glass-walled boardroom in Manhattan, reviewing the final meticulous paperwork for a $50 million acquisition deal my hedge fund was spearheading. The ink on the contracts was dark and definitive, a tangible representation of complete sovereignty. I signed my name at the bottom of the page, the movement smooth, practiced, and unhesitating. The Vance family had become a closed file, a minor financial discrepancy I had long since corrected and permanently archived. I had heard through the sterile, predictable channels of industry gossip that Jacob was severely struggling to maintain his entry-level position. His innate arrogance was rapidly alienating his new, unimpressed managers, and his inability to function without my financial safety net had rendered him entirely obsolete in the corporate world. Jessica remained in total social isolation. Her former high society friends had severed all remaining ties, the exact moment her financial ruin became public knowledge. They had been utterly cast out of the bloodline blueprint they so fiercely protected and weaponized against outsiders. That is the ultimate, inevitable tragedy of generational entitlement. When you build your entire identity on a fragile foundation of inherited superiority rather than earned competence, you construct a glass house on an active fault line. You assume the ground will always hold steady simply because of your last name. The moment a real tremor hits, the entire structure shatters, leaving you holding nothing but broken reflections of who you used to be. I had spent 5 years trying to fit into their archaic architecture, foolishly believing that my financial success could somehow purchase their genuine respect. I had normalized their subtle cruelty because I thought silent endurance was a synonym for loyalty. I had convinced myself that if I just generated enough capital, they would eventually see my worth. But casting off their bloodline blueprint allowed me to finally architect my own sovereignty. I permanently stopped funding other people's illusions and started investing exclusively in my own reality. There is a profound, almost clinical peace in realizing that you do not owe toxic people a graceful exit. You do not owe them a soft cushion for the steep fall they orchestrated entirely themselves. My retaliation wasn't born of heated malice or messy emotional outbursts. It was born of absolute, uncompromising self-respect. I established a secure perimeter, and when they brazenly breached it, they were met with the full, unemotional weight of the law and the ledger. The transition from being a silent investor in someone else's life to becoming the CEO of my own was the most profitable move I ever made. I look out at the skyline now, not as an outsider hoping for an invitation, but as the owner of the building. I've come to realize that closure doesn't require an apology from the people who broke you. It doesn't require a dramatic, cinematic confrontation or a tearful reconciliation where everyone learns a valuable lesson. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free from the heavy debt they left behind. I forgave myself for staying as long as I did, for letting my balance sheet be drained by emotional parasites, and in doing so, I evicted them from my mind entirely. The profound peace I feel now isn't just the absence of conflict, it is the active presence of absolute control over my own borders. I built my empire, I fiercely protected my peace, and I ensured that my success would never again be used as a subsidy for someone else's cruelty. If you found Ashley's story satisfying, hit the like button and share this with someone who needs the courage to set their own boundaries today. Don't forget to subscribe for more.